Thanks everyone for coming. I thought I'd start with work from 1997. The handover of Hong Kong had just taken place. I didn't understand fully the history and stuff behind all of this, but I felt compelled to try and make something about it. So I went into my kitchen and I grabbed hold of these cans of lychee or lychee fruit. On the label is these landscapes of beautiful Arcadian Chinese rural landscape with this factory in the background. And so I shredded it and I turned it into this kind of version of a sort of Monet-like sort of painting, an abstract sort of landscape. So I thought I'd start with that. This was when I was a student. When I first started at St. Martin's in London, I used to be a figurative painter, and then I went completely abstract. And at the time, it was what I think was the digital and communications revolution. So the internet and mobile phone technology was just coming available. And this, to me, sort of blew my mind, because it was like the new information landscape of information moving across the world, capital, money sort of transmitting, trillions in an instant. And wherever the flows of that capital accumulates, forms utopias and dystopias. I was searching for a different material to make painting with. I wanted to make paintings without paint, to ask questions about what I thought painting is. And so by shredding the world map, I was using what I thought was the stuff that I wanted to make work about. It was a way of sort of making these kind of digital, all over sort of paintings. And then this one is made with star charts. And at the time I was reading a book by William Gibson called Neuromancer, and it's where the term cyberspace comes from. A science fiction writer to describe a modern day new landscape. And the protagonist at the beginning looks up into the sky and sees a sky that is so dense with information, it's almost crackling. And I found this a really a beautiful way of describing a fantasy, if you like, of a future world. A world that where information is literally flowing through us, which is what's happening right now. So the amount of time that we spend on the phone now, teleporting through our smartphones, firing a signal off into space, bouncing off a satellite into a desert, into a building that's got a computer, the hard drive whirring around before sending it back and to your phone. You're kind of teleporting electronically through these spaces. We don't think about it so much, but those were the spaces that I was becoming really fascinated by. And so this new technology, this revolution, created this kind of utopic euphoria about what it would enable us to do, that borders and boundaries would come down and the world would come together. But then, of course, history showed us that things like the tech stock crash, the millennium bug, we entered the new millennium with a kind of a literal fear of computers blowing up in front of us and airplanes dropping out of the sky. I don't know whether you remember Y2K bug. So I found this oscillation between utopia and dystopia sort of really fascinating and something I wanted to capture. And so here, this is actually a photograph of circuit boards that are then videoed, played on the television, photographed again, collaged, and then on the photocopying machine, the color photocopying machine, I would move it around while it's being scanned. And for me, it created this kind of what I think of as a virtual painting, in reference to what I felt was the new landscapes that we occupy, these virtual worlds. So I'm constantly trying to search for languages or new languages to capture a sense of our modernity. Here there's a black and white version in reference to a famous German painter called Gerhard Richter. And his blurred paintings are a way of questioning histories, fixed points of histories written by particular civilizations. And so by blurring it, you're questioning these kind of fixed notions of histories. And here, this is the stock listings of the Financial Times, a material that I start to use pretty much all the time, up to date, to work that you'll see in Expo. After I graduated from the Royal College in 2001, I started to gravitate back towards figurative work. So here I'm sort of shredding, again, the stock listings of the Financial Times. I thought, what better material to use than financial newspaper in reference to or reflecting on the dominant economic model of capitalism and consumerism. And then I went on a residency in Pakistan, and when I came back I started making work like this, because then I started getting really interested in landscapes that have literally had the apocalypse fused into them. So this is the Nevada desert where most atomic nuclear tests took place. And then I got interested in utopic architecture. So this is Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation. Apologies for my poor French. It was a kind of monument that I felt compelled to sort of like visualize as a monument of a kind of failed dream in some ways. And again, going back to this sort of oscillation between, the utopias and dystopias. This was a residency in the Chinese Art Centre in Manchester. And really, at this point, I was kind of at a make or break situation, because I wasn't sure whether I'd still be able to be an artist. So every day I was making art like as if it was my last. And luckily, some curators sort of saw my show, and I was able to continue making up to today. This is a painting called Terror, and these are Scooby-Doo ghosts. And at the time, the US was heading towards an invasion in Iraq in response to 9/11. And there was all this kind of creation of fear over what was happening in the Middle East in order to justify a war there. And so I wanted to find a sort of a darkly humorous way of capturing a sense of that. A painting called Technophobia, trying to capture a sense of, I suppose, the way how we're so entirely reliant on technology, and how we occupy a technological landscape, and yet we don't really understand like how it sort of works. We just sort of adapt and sort of live within it. And of course now one of the great existential sort of crises of humanity, along with climate change, is the advent of AI. So once that occurs, the question of what does it mean to be a human being is one of the great philosophical questions that we will be facing in the 21st century. So then I started making a series of paintings here on tourist hunters. These are kind of, for me, an extreme example of late capitalism, where tourists literally pay a guide to take them to an animal and to shoot them, and then claim them as a trophy. So there's this kind of really abstracted relationship to nature that I wanted to talk about here. Hunting these creatures for what? It would be for status, power, and to show off dominance over the animal kingdom, as opposed to one in which it understands the relationship between us and the environment and the animals themselves. I was starting to look at sort of classical mythologies, for example, Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So here I've kind of rendered it into a sort of modern neon-like sort of world. Neon being an important aspect of my work because of its association with an artificial world, a world that we've kind of constructed to symbolize our modern world. This was a painting because around this time there was all this talk about the rise of China. So I was starting to think about trying to find a way to sort of paint about that. And so on the left-hand side, you can see a sort of collage of Chinese propaganda poster, and then these kind of rising sort of like city floating outwards. And this is a sort of more updated version of Manifest Destiny, which was a propaganda poster for the pioneers to justify conquest over America. And then by now the crisis had hit us, the 2008 crisis, and there was a 2-week period where we felt adrift, and we weren't sure whether the financial system itself, the global financial system itself, was going to still work. And so I painted this image of Jericho's raft, and it's kind of here, sort of floating off into the void. Because it was based on a true story, the original painting, in which the shipwreck called Medusa was carrying bourgeois sort of passengers, and they ended up eating each other on the raft. So it's kind of like this sort of ultra sort of consumerist analogy that I was trying to pull together into this painting. This was a solo exhibition in the New Art Gallery, Warsaw. The 9 buildings that you see at the bottom are the 9 too big to fail companies that collapsed during the financial crisis. It was this sort of incredible sort of 2-week period where companies that had been in existence for over 150 years in some cases, I think, had suddenly sort of collapsed. Their stock value was at 0. This was the first show where I started to really expand the different sort of mediums that I was using. So here, including 4 video screens of bull riders, again in reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This is the top 10 billionaires, top 10 dead celebrities still earning, and top 10 hackers. So I was trying to identify modern stratas of our new landscapes. I mean, it's a fairly silly way of doing it. Top 10 anything is a bit daft, but it served its purpose of trying to identify the new classes, if you like, of people. Because even back then, I think there was no laws to govern what hackers were doing. Technically, hackers weren't actually doing anything illegal. So some of these people aren't out to steal information. I think some of them created the World Wide Web. I think the second guy from the top row, and some people helped create Apple. So 2010, this is a piece that's based on WikiLeaks' release of some torture images from Guantanamo Bay. For me, this was this incredible puncturing of an idea of a good nation, that there is one good nation that behaves, and then other nations are kind of the bad people. It showed us that these terrible things, of course, occur within our own countries. So these are laser-etched images onto layers of the stock listings of the Financial Times. So it was the act of destruction creating the image of destruction. This is a relatively new body of work where I use an open source algorithm to reorganize the pixels of images from Dutch still life paintings from 370 years ago. This is what's considered to be the birth of modern capitalism, with the first global company, the East India Trade Company, and the first recorded economic bubble. 2008 made me sort of want to really find out why something like that happened. So it led to me looking at the first bubble in history, which was over the speculation of tulip bulbs. So at its peak, it sold for the price of a house, which is completely absurd. So by using this algorithm of reorganizing these pixels, you could technically put all those pixels back, so then it would be the original painting. By using it, I was kind of metaphorically suggesting a kind of repetition of history. This is a series of painting called The Course of Empire by an American painter. It charts a fictional series of 5 paintings of the savage state: Arcadian, consummation, destruction, and desolation. For me, it's a fascinating sort of series of painting in a tradition of the American sublime, but of course the romanticization of such landscape painting is usually of tiny little figures on these landscapes, and God is this overwhelming experience that brings you into a transcendent state that brings you closer to God. The other thing is that the depiction of people that were there are usually very rare. And so there's this sort of presentation of virgin territory in which people that went there to occupy and conquer are able to then to use the romantic language. And here, they romanticize the destruction of a civilization or a fall of a civilization, but they don't acknowledge the destruction that they caused in order to attain the civilization that they had created and built themselves. Originally a painting by Caspar David Friedrich, an iconic one of the Romantic spirit, of the man overlooking, the terrain and over the sea of mist, kind of conqueror, but also meant to be in awe of the experience of nature itself. These enormous existential-like sort of forces when you're in confrontation with such enormity, vastness, makes you question, your existence. Why? Who am I? What am I doing here? And this is completely abstracted. So these are all the original sort of pixels of that painting, but now rendered into like the landscape itself. This is a propaganda poster by called Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan. Anyuan is where the revolution was sparked through the mining strike, but he was never there. So it was a way of writing himself into an important event in history. Painting called Here Be Dragons, based on a Dutch still life. So I was conflating here now with the new Silk Road in China. At the bottom there is the abstract motif of a artificial island in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is worth $3 to $7 trillion a year. China is surrounded by 400 US military bases. Each of these islands, although originally were said to not be for military purposes, are now turning out to be the case. So they essentially are almost like aircraft carriers, but stationary. So I use all sorts of textures and paint techniques in order to accentuate different sort of ways of experiencing the surfaces of the painting, from the actual sort of materiality of the paint through to the symbolic sort of numbers of the stock listings themselves. It's this kind of way of creating multiple layers of perception into these different spaces. Painting on 1,000 plateaus. And here is a kind of traditional Chinese landscape painting. But where there would normally be huts or pagodas, I've substituted them for these houses that you can see. They're otherwise called nail houses, or known as holdout houses, last to sell in the property development. The huts and the pagodas are there to project yourself into for a meditative like sort of platform to question your relationship between nature and to ask those sorts of philosophical questions again of like, what does it mean to be in this world and so on. So this is another nail house which actually went viral. Now it's called a nail house because of the proverb, if a nail sticks up, bang it back down. The reason why this went viral is because it was the last property to sell, but the owners didn't want to sell. And so she had her husband at the top of the stairs with a pair of nunchucks. And if any councillor or local official came by, he'd obviously threaten them and shoot them away. And it garnered an enormous amount of media attention. And so these images went viral. And as a result of it going viral, then China censored them. They banned these images because they started to then become a symbol of resistance. So here you have an image of what I think of as a unit of civilization, the home. And then in the middle is the Three Gorges Dam, which is the harnessing of nature to power civilization. And then at the top is a divine order. And so this show was called Here Be Dragons. Here Be Dragons because in, I think it was the 17th century, there was a map, a Western map, and the areas of unknown territories they called Here Be Dragons. And it just so happens that those sorts of territories were the south coast of China. And I just really like this sort of convergence of coincidences. Another variation of Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, but here with bull riders. In the foreground is Guantanamo Bay, and then in the distance is Iran. So you can see I'm always interested in trying to sort of like push at the different ways of painting. I paint onto plastic with different techniques, sometimes throwing it on. or squeezing it out or using a cupcake decorating pipe. And then I peel them off the plastic and then recollage them back on. This is a map of Middle East, but I've taken away all the national borders and all you're left with is oil pipelines. This was a show in a gallery that represents me, that's showing me at the moment at Expo Chicago. And this painting is of all the artificial islands in China, in the South Sea. To the left is Mount Sinai and to the right is Mount Song. And the constellation in the distance is the One Belt, One Road, which is the biggest human project in history so far, which is the reignition of the Silk Road by China. And so to the right you can see acrobatic images from a particular era called the Let 100 Flowers Bloom. It's when he allowed people to criticize. He said, we welcome criticism. And so lots of people did criticize, but of course he took down names and those people started to disappear. Acrobats are often used as well as a way of sort of showing the superhuman sort of aspect of a culture or of a civilization. And so I'm using sand here as a material, and I spray paint it from different directions, and it creates a kind of moonscape-like effect. And sand for me is this idea that everything eventually becomes sand as well. So as great as any civilization becomes, and I think of Ozymandias, the poem, in which a great visage of a statue lies in the desert, and it signifies what was once a great civilization. And again, coming back to a kind of existential question of like, well, we build these things, but if they crumble to dust, eventually, what is the purpose? So my last show was in Hong Kong in 2018, and I got really interested in Shenzhen. So Shenzhen is about 40 years ago was just a fishing village, and now it borders Hong Kong. That red pink area is actually the border between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. And now it's known as the Silicon Valley of China. And so when the handover took place in Hong Kong, so Hong Kong to the right here, Shenzhen on the left, manufacturing in Hong Kong was hollowed out and the workforce moved to places like Shenzhen. And as a result, now the GDP of Shenzhen is, I think, higher than Hong Kong now. So it's an extraordinary sort of economic miracle, of China's centralized planning, whereby they gave Shenzhen some economic freedom to do and enact policies that has created, including a stock exchange that I think is 7th in the world, just behind Hong Kong. Thing in a matter of decades. So this is a new series of work as well, which is a traditional Chinese windows made from newspaper and bamboo. So I was interested in China's rapid urbanization and the way how many of these old buildings are obviously being collapsed and built over. And so for me, it's a demarcation between communism and the paradox of communist capitalism. So yeah, I made this show obviously before all of the Hong Kong protests that have been currently, ongoing. Obviously, the notion of a home is a really important archetype, if you like. I think for all of us, but particularly for me at that moment, because although I've never lived in Hong Kong, it's always felt like home because my parents have always talked about it, and so it's felt like it's very much part of my identity as well. So the word home can mean the building itself, but it can also mean to return, to home back. And that was something that I was trying to sort of work with in this exhibition. So this painting, for example, is called Vanishing Point, and that's a map of Hong Kong. And the graffiti that you see in the distance is from Ghost in the Shell. It's an iconic cult anime. It talks about a lot more philosophical ideas to do with identity. And so this is the moment when she looks up, and she's actually a robot, she looks up into the building and she sees another version of herself. And suddenly she has this kind of existential crisis about who she is. And so for me, because the anime is also, the city is based on Hong Kong, it seemed like this nice analogy to be able to talk about Hong Kong's existential crisis, especially in the advent of like larger provinces of China becoming enormously powerful on their doorstep. A painting called River, it's the Mekong River, and China dams the river upstream, which means that all of the other nations that rely downstream, China has political leverage over. This is called Roof of the World, and it's of the Himalayan mountains in the distance, otherwise called the water towers of China, which feed the two main rivers of China. Tibet has no army. Within the frame, or the historical frame of the 100 years of humiliation when the West invaded China, Tibet with no army is also open to foreign control. If a foreign power takes control, they take control of the two water towers of China, and thus the main arteries of a civilization is rivers. And that would then enable enormous political leverage over the sovereignty of China itself. Now, so I'm not making a judgment about whether that's right or wrong over the people and stuff. So they built a high-speed rail into Tibet, and they're changing the demographic with more Han Chinese into the population. And so I was hinting also at Turner's famous painting of rain, steam, and speed. And it's a famous painting of a train coming out of the mist. It's the future coming out at you. But here, I'm suggesting a future going into this kind of neon world. Staring at the sun, which is another nail house, which is buildings that disappeared from the internet. But here, there's also a Winnie the Pooh in the middle. Winnie the Pooh was used as a symbol that went viral because netizens, people on the internet, were comparing Winnie the Pooh to President Xi Jinping. And it first started with President Xi Jinping and Obama, so it was Winnie the Pooh and Tigger. And the internet decided to censor these images as well. So I was interested in this sort of idea of disappearances, and so staring at, and the title of this painting is Staring at the Sun. So in many cultures the sun would represent the emperor, but of course staring at the sun you would go blind, and so it was to do with like different notions of being blinded to particular things. And here I've updated the Winnie the Pooh to be a king because in recent years President Xi Jinping has written himself into the constitution that no other person has done other than Chairman Mao. And so mountains are an important feature of my work, and because they represent the bridge between earth and heaven. And according to an essay by the Met Museum in New York, the mountains in classical Chinese painting represents the state. And so the educated elite, who are the only ones that are really making any classic Chinese paintings, were using that as a way to talk about their relationship to the state through a codified form. But of course, the Romantic language was still to do with one's meditative spiritual relationship to nature versus civilization. And I think that's the last slide. Actually, I think that's so that's where I'll end.